Dragon Age: The Veilguard. This is a game I have been keeping a very close eye on, as have many other people, because it represents an extremely high-stakes release for one of the industry's most prolific developers, BioWare. Dragon Age, of course, is the franchise which last had a release in 2014 with Dragon Age Inquisition. That year, it actually won Game of the Year at the very first Game Awards that Jeff Keighley threw. But since then, Dragon Age has been on ice, while BioWare went off and made Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem, and we all know how those games ended up at the end of the day, and it left a lot of people really worried whether or not BioWare was capable of putting out really compelling and interesting RPGs with good roleplay and narrative consequence and fun adventure. Confidence was shaken, to say the very, very least. And that's led a lot of people to look at Dragon Age: The Veilguard skeptically, withholding judgment and excitement until they are shown a reason to be excited. And in this video, I'm going to be explaining to you my thoughts on the game after playing it for 7 hours at a preview event in early September. I have a lot of strong thoughts, and we're gonna go through all of it, and I will say that they have given us pretty strict guidelines to avoid spoilers, but they have allowed us to show a lot of the game. So I will be doing that and adhering to very strict guidelines. So if there's some footage you think I'm describing that you're like, oh, why don't you just show me? If I'm not showing it, it's probably because they asked me not to, just so you know. But if you're looking for the spark notes of my impressions and opinions of Dragon Age: The Veilguard after playing it for basically an entire day, I will tell you that I am thoroughly impressed. What I played was incredibly polished, graphically stunning, fairly narratively complex, and above all, entertaining. Just a few weeks ago, I made a video called A Skeptical Look at Dragon Age: The Veilguard, where I outlined many of my concerns and frustrations, like the first trailer that they dropped, such as the troubled recent releases that BioWare has had, EA's track record with things. I went through it all, and I have not been that gentle towards Anthem or Andromeda or BioWare or EA in general. And despite that, they still were willing to let me try the game because they were so confident in what they had here. And after playing it, I see why they are so confident. I don't think everybody will fall in love with this, but I do think Dragon Age fans and people who like fantastical adventure roleplay games, they are in for a real treat if the entire game is like what I played. And in this video, I'm going to break down why with more details, lots of gameplay footage, all of the nitty-gritty goodness. So without further ado, let's get into it. Just make sure to like the video if you enjoy it and subscribe for more videos and stuff, because that'd be cool. But with all that said, let's just get right into it. As I said, we played about 7 hours of the game over the course of a single day. We were brought to a big campus that EA operates within in San Francisco, California. They had taken a large open room that they use for events like these and converted it into a sort of Dragon Age playroom with tons of computers set up. The version of the game we played was on PC. I'm not exactly sure what the build was, but I believe it was running on a 4080 and everything was cranked. So what you're seeing most likely represents a very, very beautiful and maxed out version of the game. They had 5 missions for us to play through, 3 of which we were allowed to record, and the other 2 we were of course allowed to play and take notes on, though they asked that we not share too much about them since they involve heavy spoilers. And starting at about 10:30 a.m., they just let us go. And if we wanted to play straight through lunch, we could do that. If we wanted to play into the evening, we could do that, so long as we adhered to the strict stop time of 6 p.m. And that's pretty much what I did. I played a lot. I even replayed missions I had already done, making different choices to see how it would change the outcome in the next mission that directly followed it. And it allowed me to really poke and prod and see how differently you could handle certain conversations or certain narrative beats or choices that seemingly have differing consequences. And it's once again a perfect example of why for these types of games, when you're trying to prove that you have something, giving people time to actually test it is crucial, because I found some interesting stuff that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Spoiler alert, your choices like really matter. Like a lot. The first thing we got to do is go through the prologue. This was roughly an hour and a half and included some of the footage that's already been released publicly. This time though, we could go through the entire character creator ourselves, design our appearance, select our class, faction, playstyle, lineage, everything. Perhaps one of the most interesting bits about this was selecting your backstory. This actually does have a pretty significant impact on dialogue with characters and NPCs while you're going through the rest of the game, especially in later missions, later in Act 1. You see, what we were allowed to play was basically the prologue, a select few missions in the middle of Act 1, and then a big moment in the middle of Act 1, and then the finale of Act 1, or at least half of it, basically. They ended on a cliffhanger just to keep us hooked, but I have a pretty good idea of how Act 1 ends. That being said, there is a lot of game here, and I was pretty impressed at how varied it felt while playing through it. Just a selection of Act 1, it seemed like there were many, many differing levels and art styles and quest lines in terms of tone. Some of them were very lighthearted and just sort of, I don't know what else to call it other than pop culture fantasy, but then other segments of the game were extremely dark and kind of disturbing. It was extremely varied, which is something I was hoping for. In case you don't recall, the trailer that they dropped in early June of this year was not received super great. Most people felt that it was tonally just off. It didn't feel like Dragon Age. It felt like your standard appealing to modern audiences type game where they're trying desperately to be witty and funny with characters that don't take things seriously. It just was tonally off. And it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and I think set strange expectations where people were worried this was going to be yet another one of those games. But something interesting happened when I was at the event, and maybe like I shouldn't say this, but I think it's interesting, so I'm going to say it anyways. And that is that I spoke to a number of people that, I'll keep it vague, are involved in Dragon Age the Veilguard to one degree or another, whether they're involved with the marketing or the development, what have you. And one thing I heard from pretty much everybody that I spoke to was that they didn't like that trailer either. They didn't want that trailer to go up and be the first look at Dragon Age the Veilguard. It seems as though internally the people actually making the game felt as though that was not representative of what the game was. It was potentially, my inference was that it was somebody higher up within EA or EA's marketing team that made that choice to frame the trailer in that way and try to sell the game in that style. And the people working on the game weren't happy about it, but their hands were kind of tied. They didn't get to make that choice. And since then, they've been trying to dig themselves out of that hole. But for me, it was reassuring to hear that the team that made the game was not thrilled with that trailer either. They felt that it wasn't indicative of what's actually here. And I can attest to this. What we played had some lighthearted moments, sure, and some of the characters and companions I found more likable than others, but there were also segments that were quite dark. Areas and towns that were taken over by the Blighted, or where a dragon might have attacked and wreaked havoc. Like, it was not all glitz and glamour and lighthearted silliness. There was some intense stuff here as well, and I think that this is much more indicative of what the whole game will be, not just that like kitschy campy trailer that we got in early June. And for me, that's really, really encouraging because I personally didn't like that trailer, and I don't know of anybody else who did, but nonetheless, I guess just make of that what you will. Now, one of the other things that was sort of the elephant in the room for a lot of us that were playing was how linear the game was going to end up being. What we saw, of course, in the previous gameplay demo was the prologue section, the very first 45 minutes roughly of the game, and that was very, very linear, as you would expect. Most games have very linear openings to show you the ropes and explain how things work, and as a result, it can often lead to situations where people feel underwhelmed if that's their first impression. However, what I will say is that the sections that we got to play later on in the game were much, much more varied, though I think I need to explain a little bit more about how the game is laid out. Now, the way I would describe the level design in Dragon Age the Veilguard, at least the stuff that I tried, is roughly similar to like God of War 2018, where quest lines or the main story will take you to a certain spot and you'll go through a largely linear path while completing that quest and going through that area. You can return to that area. There's other secrets to be found and goodies to be found and side quests there and stuff like that. But it's not just totally open world at the end of the day. Like it's more linear open as opposed to just wide open, if that makes sense. It's hard to explain, but fundamentally, what they're trying to do here is to give you more handcrafted areas that have more intentionality behind them rather than just a big open world that was mostly procedurally generated and that you can run around and find randomly placed stuff that spawns about. Because really at the end of the day, what they wanted to do was to give you levels that were interesting, that were memorable, and to be able to craft encounters within those levels that are impacted by your choices and your decisions and your build. And honestly, this is just kind of hard to explain. It's something when you play it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you're doing. And it's really not that big of a deal. I've heard some people complain that they haven't gone full open world or anything. But in this case, having played the game, I actually think this works better given what they're trying to do here than if they just went Inquisition all over again and just went for quantity instead of quality. But don't get it twisted, this game is not small at all. It seems massive by all accounts. I've tried to get a clear answer out of them as to how big it actually is, and nobody was willing to just outright say, we expect it to take you 80 hours or 150 hours or 40 hours. Nobody was willing to just say how big it was. All they would tell me was that it was 3 acts, and each of the acts are pretty large, and what we played were very small selections of Act 1, which would just be a third, and it took us like 7 hours, 6 hours-ish to get through those select like missions. So if you extrapolate and you go, okay, well maybe it's like 15, 20 hours per act, maybe you get to like 60, 70 hours perhaps. But again, all of that's just speculation. And to be clear, I'm good with whatever they're doing. They were able to keep the pacing up pretty good while we were playing. Granted, we were playing selected little chunks of the game, but if they can keep this rhythm and pace up throughout 40, 50, 60 hours, I will be a very, very happy camper, especially when you factor this in. The game is listed on Steam for sale for only $60. This isn't one of those like $70 quadruple A games. Like they're releasing it for $60, which for EA to do is insane. It's already Steam Deck verified. I think it was a full 2 months ahead of launch that they first announced it was Steam Deck verified, which is insane as well. And they've also clarified that it's not going to require the EA launcher to play, which is also a very nice win. If you buy it on Steam, you can just hit play and play it. Like, it's funny that that is like a W, but that was not a given for a lot of other EA games for a very long time. And now they're lifting that requirement, which is, in my opinion, a very good thing to see. Now, in some of the other missions that we got to play, we reset with a new playable character because they loaded us to a separate area of the game later on, so it didn't carry over our created character. That's why you'll be seeing somebody else instead of the character that I chose. As I said at the top, I also replayed certain areas multiple times, which allowed me to test out different builds, different archetypes and classes, and so you'll also see different characters in those instances. We got the chance to see a lot of dialogue play out between the party members. There was even the chance to have a little bit of romantic flirting with different characters. There was even the chance to talk with characters like Harding and even flirt it up a little bit if you are somebody that likes to play these games and check out the romance options and stuff. It seems like there's a lot here and a lot of depth. If you're wondering why Harding is all bruised up in this shot, it's actually because in the first mission of the game, I made a choice to basically have her help me, and it put her into harm's way. She got injured as a result in a cutscene that followed that, and as a result, for the rest of like the first chunk of Act 1, she was all bruised up and messed up, even with these like scars and things and the wounds and cuts slowly healing over time. The first mission I did after the prologue, she was extremely battered and bruised up, bruises everywhere. And then this sequence is a little bit later, maybe like a quarter of the way through Act 1, based on what I was told, and she's actually recovering better. She's starting to heal up, but she's still obviously injured. And it's once again like a cool visual in-game representation of one of your choices. And she'll even have dialogue that reflects it. People asking her if she's doing okay. She looks pretty rough and things like that. Whereas if I chose a different way, a different character would be in this spot and would have the damage done to them as well. I love this kind of thing, and there's many, many examples of that in Dragon Age, the Veilguard, that I saw, some that I can talk about like this and others that I can't. And it gets me very excited to see how this would play out when you're playing the full game, making tons of choices that affect not just one of these characters, but all of your companions. Now, I did try a variety of classes and character builds while I was playing. I also tried different combinations and mixtures of companions to see how they would mix and match together. And I know there's been a lot of like skepticism or cynicism, whatever it is, towards the choice to make it so you can't tactically control companions. But I will say, after playing the game myself, I don't blame them for making that choice whatsoever. Combat is so frenetic, so crazy, hectic, especially when you're dealing with boss fights or fights with many enemies on screen at a time. Things can get really, really crazy really quickly. And being able to just quickly use like shortcuts to activate abilities for your party members, and then being able to swap those out for different abilities or different party members that can do other things faster or that complement this skill of yours better. It's really, really fluid, and I was impressed at just how quickly I was able to get used to it. If I had to compare it to something, I would say that it plays similarly to like God of War 2018 mixed with Assassin's Creed Odyssey with the quick ability wheel. It's an interesting amalgamation, but it does also make sense when you consider when this game was being created and built out, most likely around that 2018 period, where two of the biggest games of that year that were both nominated for Game of the Year were Assassin's Creed Odyssey and God of War 2018. And as a result, they probably took a few nods and ideas from that, things that they thought were working and that players seemed to connect with and really like. And I like both of those games, and I think they play really well, and I'm glad to say that I enjoyed the combat here. The early game combat they showed in the prologue, in the first 45 minutes or so of the game, was certainly slow and looked like a real trudge in comparison to what you might expect from a deep, expansive RPG. But even halfway through Act 1, I was impressed with just how varied character builds could be. As I said earlier, I was at this event with other content creators, YouTubers, streamers, you name it, they were probably there. I was sitting next to Luality, who does a bunch of amazing Baldur's Gate 3 content, next to Wolfheart, who also does a bunch of like Witcher 3, Baldur's Gate RPG focused content. And all of these people had wildly different play styles and builds that they had selected and choices in the skill tree that they had gone through. And they all played wildly differently. Some were just focused on high damage single impact shots based on stacking different abilities. Others were focused on slowing down time and then introducing slow burning status effects that would whittle down the damage over time, making big crowds of enemies easier to control. And it was pretty cool to see that only halfway through Act 1, presumably only maybe 10 hours into the game, people's playstyles were already varied that much just based on experimentation. Imagine what this is going to be like when people actually get their hands on it and start looking for all the super special, unique items that can break builds this way or that way. It's going to be crazy. Speaking of crazy, the game is graphically stunning, and I don't need to tell you that. I know some people don't like the subsurface scattering that they use for some character faces and stuff. I personally think the game looks ridiculously good, and I am thoroughly impressed every time I see like the hair sim or just the way that they're able to render hair and hair physics. Coming off of Dragon Age Inquisition, where one of the most famous and common complaints about that game was how bad the hair sim was and how bad hair looked in that game, to see them come here and pull a total 180 where the hair is ridiculously impressive is just awesome to see. I mean, it really is cool, and it's a huge improvement over pretty much any other open world adventure game I can think of in recent memory. They really cranked the dials when it came to the hair fidelity, and then the fidelity of skin, subsurface scattering. Everything they're doing here is crazy. And this was one of the points of concern for a lot of us, which was that this is running on the same engine as Mass Effect Andromeda, as Anthem. This is an engine that has had lots of problems with games of this type, at least in years past. However, it really seems like whatever issues they had with Andromeda or with Anthem, they fixed or were able to overcome over the last however many years. And I got to hand it to them. I thought they would just throw in the towel and be like, okay, this engine's not working for us. Let's just try something different. But no, they've come out and figured it out. And, you know, maybe they made some compromises. They made the levels more linear, and that made it easier to manage. I'm not really sure what went into these design changes. Maybe there's more complexity to it. But what I know is that what I played was graphically really impressive and polished out the ever-living ass. I've participated in a number of preview events for games, including ones that were roughly 2 months before launch. And in almost all of them, the games run quite rough. There are bugs, there might be frame dips, this or that, but it's understood that this is an in-progress build. It's in development. What we're playing is probably even a few months older than the actual event because they had to prepare it. And so you usually can't take away a whole lot from the performance of demos and previews like this at events. However, that's usually because the game runs way worse at the events than they will at launch. This game already runs ridiculously well. Granted, we were playing on a high-end PC, but when they say that they have optimized the game and they have focused on polish, and this is not going to be one of those Andromeda situations, I believe them because I could not tell you the last time I was at a preview event for any game that was 2 months out from launch at the time that I played it, and it ran this well. I had maybe 1 or 2 dips below 60 frames in my entire 7 hours with the game. And even then, it was for like maybe a quarter of a second before it came back and was running back at 60. It was maybe dropping like 3-4 frames when I went into like a new level and the doors open and I walked through. Like very, very inconsequential. I am thoroughly impressed here, and I hope the whole game is this polished and it's not just Act 1, but good God Almighty, I'll give them this. It is very impressive the work they've done to get this running well. I already thought that the Steam Deck verification 2 months ahead of time was a good sign, but now seeing that it runs this well across the board, like I really think they are trying to prove a point that this is not going to be an Andromeda situation again. But speaking of Andromeda, one of the other frustrations was people felt that the writing was not that great in that game. So people have been skeptical of the writing in this game to see whether or not it holds up or is going to be able to hold a candle to what they did in previous Dragon Age games. And what I will say is that while I'm not overly familiar with the lore of Dragon Age or anything like that, I found myself compelled by the stories that they were telling in these isolated missions. I was compelled by some of the choices you had to make, some of which are quite consequential, which we'll talk about in just a second. But all told, I was captivated. I thought the performances of pretty much the entire cast were compelling, and other than 1 or maybe 2 characters, I don't think that there's a single bad egg in this basket. The one character I didn't really connect with was this companion, Balara. You find her like super early in the game and talk with her. She just comes off as like very, I'm so quirky, like, oh my God, I'm so quirky. You know, it's that kind of energy that's just like desperate for attention that I don't connect with. I'm sorry. I'm too old and I just don't have whatever it takes to put up with it. And so what I took away from her is like, okay, she's like kind of annoying, a little much for me. I'm sure other people might find her charming or silly or funny. But for me, I found myself actively not taking her to do stuff because I just kind of annoying to me. But that's the nice thing about having a lot of companions is that you can choose to not take some that you don't connect with, and that's okay. I'm going to offend some people here. I don't really like Will in Baldur's Gate 3. I find him just kind of dry and uninteresting. I know people are going to be upset at me, but I just choose not to play with him when I go through Baldur's Gate 3 runs. Like I'll take somebody else, you know, I'll take some Shadowheart over here. Maybe I'll take some Gale, you know, have a little bit of this, have a little bit of that. That's the great thing about games with lots of companions is that if you don't connect with somebody, you can choose somebody else. Okay. So it's not like Balara being kind of annoying to me ruins the game, just to be perfectly clear, because I know some people are going to be like, oh God, he doesn't like this companion, therefore the game's bad. No, not at all. The fact that they have variety, that's the spice of life. I'm okay with that. Just because I didn't connect with her or find her interesting does not mean other people will have the same reaction. Having said all of that, it is hard to gauge the quality of the main story given the small selection of gameplay that we got to experience. But what I will say is they do not shy away from big set pieces, big encounters, story beats, or major moments of consequence with basically consequence from your decisions that could have a major impact on thousands and thousands of people. You can straight up ruin entire cities based on your choices, and I love it. I can't describe specifics of some of the most impactful choices that were here, but to put it simply, there are multiple times in the game, from what I understand, just within Act 1, where you will be prompted to make choices that will have long-lasting effects for the rest of the game, where you choose to go this route basically, and your run through of the game as a result will be fundamentally different from other people that chose the opposite choice. There are multiple instances of this. The devs talked about it, how they really wanted to empower players to make choices that were consequential and to show them that those choices have an impact. Remember I said earlier that I basically played through my lunch break and wanted to test different outcomes by choosing different choices, going through and having this dialogue choice versus this one and choosing to go that route versus this route. I tested some stuff that I was not allowed to record and I'm not allowed to spoil for you, but what I will say is that there were at least 2 or 3 instances where you can have a totally different outcome that is extremely impactful, not just to you as the player, but to your companions and to people your companions know, to their quest lines. It can be potentially even like literally earth shaking based on your choices here. And it is exactly what I want to see out of an RPG, for me to be able to make choices that have an impact that's not just told to me in like a different splash screen at the ending credits, but something that actually affects my gameplay, affects the levels that I'll be going through, the NPCs I'm interacting with. That's what I want to see. And they've pulled it off here. And it really makes me excited to see what the entire game is going to present when you have 3 acts of those types of decisions, not just a couple quest lines like we had. Now, as for other variations in terms of gameplay between players, there's the narrative side of things and then there's the gameplay side of things. I've already alluded to the different classes and stuff that you're able to pick from. I was able, thankfully, to test out everything from rogue gameplay to, as you can see here, magic-based combat. And I was suspicious of the magic build at first. I know a lot of people were saying that they didn't really like it at the event. They were like, I'm just not connecting with it. But it seemed as though the pattern was if people tried to play the first few missions with magic, they didn't really like it. Once they got to later missions with the mage, they were able to experiment with much higher level spell combos with different synergies between your companions and yourself. And those people ended up really liking the combat. Now in this section of gameplay that you see here, I'm actually playing a later section of the game. It's actually like the last mission before the end of Act 1 is my understanding. And this is what they consider to be spoiler-free footage, by the way. So if this is spoiler-free, imagine what the spoiler footage looks like. But we're fighting through waves and waves of enemies as we work our way to an objective that we need to do something that I will be quiet about. But we are fighting and fighting and fighting, and I am actually really impressed with how these different builds can work together. If you choose certain companions, they have synergies with your build or with each other's builds based on the types of damage that they put out. So based on what weapons you have equipped, which abilities you have equipped, what you've upgraded, and how, you might want to take some companions versus others because they'll complement your skills better or worse. It's really, really smoothly implemented, and I found myself actually having a really, really good time. Like I said, I played through this mission that you're seeing here like I think 2.5 times. I got halfway through it before we had to stop for the hard stop. But I played this mission a few times and I was still having fun even after experimenting with different classes and builds. And I really think that this game's combat is just one of those systems that you're gonna have to just try to really get how fluid it comes off. I had a very good time. Granted, I do like Assassin's Creed Odyssey's combat. I really like God of War Ragnarok and God of War 2018's combat systems. And this plays roughly similar to those with a little bit more of a hectic tinge to it. The one thing I think that is important to note out is that in the missions we were playing, you do fight through waves and waves of the same class of enemies. They do throw in some bigger brutes. They'll throw in some different high aggression grunt type enemies. Then you might fight a big ogre, or there might be a boss fight at the end of it. It's pretty similar to what, again, you would have seen in other games that use similar combat styles to this, whether that's AC Odyssey or God of War. You fight waves and waves. It's going to come off a little samey after a while, but thankfully the gameplay loop and the combat is engaging enough that I never really found myself bothered by the lack of variety from mission to mission, because going from one mission to the next will introduce more variety, but usually within individual missions, it's pretty samey. But again, this is just video games for you. It's just kind of how that works. So this might not even really be an issue. It might just be something if we're looking to nitpick, that's where we could find it, but I figured I'd point it out nonetheless. Here's an instance where you can see those synergies, where you can see after I popped one ability from Harding on the right side of this wheel, on the left side, you can see that he has a ability that specifically combos with the ability that Harding just used. And that can also combo with abilities I have, so that you can have pretty much ultimate abilities you're popping off if you do it in a select order and way. And also, to be clear, because I've seen some people bring this up, you do not have to open the wheel every time you use an ability. It's only when you want to open up and pause time, kind of taking a breather, figuring out what you want to do. You can see in this gameplay that I'm actually using the quick activated abilities as I'm fighting through, where I'm pressing right trigger to pull open the ability wheel, and then I'm selecting left, up, right, or down on the D-pad, or XAB to activate my abilities. And so you don't have to pull the wheel up every single time. You can kind of quickly select them and figure out how you want to use them and pop them fast. But okay, at the end of this, what are the takeaways? What's my kind of final opinion? I went into this preview event expecting the game to be kind of I expected it to be a reinvention unnecessarily of a formula people already connected with. I figured it would come off as just a less impressive Witcher or God of War clone or Baldur's Gate, adjacent RPG, but they've actually managed to strike their own tone, their own presentation, and I do think there is a pretty sizable market for something like this. People like RPGs, people like fantasy adventure games, and they like high production values too, and this seems to do all of it pretty well, and they are taking active steps to try and remedy the mistakes of years past. They're releasing this game at a discount for what is considered to be AAA pricing. Nowadays, if they wanted to charge $70, they could do that and get away with it. Nobody would really bat an eye because it's a AAA main entry game in a big franchise. But in this case, they were just releasing it at $60 on Steam because they want to show you that hey, yeah, we're trying to be pro-consumer. We're trying to give this to you at a fair price. Here you go. They're doing other things like polishing the ever-living crap out of it to show that you can optimize a game and still release it and be profitable if the game is good. And it seems as though the game is, at its core, entertaining and good. And that's what I'm looking for. I just want another game that I'm going to have fun with, that I can be proud of supporting because it's priced fairly, it's optimized, it's polished. That's what we've all been begging for a year or two out of these big AAA releases that come out rushed, come out broken, come out lazily thrown together and uninspired. And this seems to be a direct answer to those frustrations. And I'm here for it, frankly. I'm excited to say that I'm excited for Dragon Age the Veilguard, and after playing this game, I feel as though this really could be something special. I'm happy to say I think BioWare might actually be back, and while this game is not going to be for everybody, I'm sure there's going to be some people that don't like the way that they've set up combat or the way that they set up the levels or this or that. I think there are many, many people who are going to find this game to be something really special and are going to eat it up. And based on my preview, I think I just might be one of those people. I hope the rest of the game holds up to this level. I hope that they're actually able to follow through on this and deliver on the very, very good impression that this gameplay makes. And I know I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on it when it releases on Halloween of this year. But with all that said, thank you for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me. We'll continue to keep a close eye on Dragon Age the Veilguard as we get closer to launch. You better believe I'm going to be watching it closely and closer than ever, especially now after I tried it and really enjoyed it. But at the end of the day, I think it is safe to be excited. I think it's safe to be intrigued by this. It really does seem as though they have worked their asses off to deliver something that they are really proud of. And after playing it myself, I can see why they are so confident and why they're so proud of it. It's not going to be for everybody, I'm sure, but I have a feeling it's going to be for me. And that makes me excited. Lingering questions I have, just to run through these real quick because I wrote them down and I was like, ooh, I should talk about this. As I said, I don't know how big the game is. I'd like to know that. I don't know if they'll announce that before the game launches. It might not even be that helpful, but it does seem it's big nonetheless. However, I wasn't able to get a clear answer as to exact length. As for whether or not extreme choice variety exists also in later acts, I'm also not sure. A lot of these types of games start off really strong with that type of thing, and then they sort of drop off in later acts while they try to tie up various strands, which is very normal. Even Baldur's Gate to a certain extent had that problem. So if you even call it a problem. So I'd like to know that. I also want to know how viable extreme playthroughs are. Like, can you just play as somebody who is extremely evil? How does that look? How do your companions react to that? I'm curious as to that because we didn't really get the chance to test enough how you could destroy relationships as well as build them up. And there's also been a lot of discussion over the companions and the way that they've set them up here. Basically, companions are designed to have their own little lives and opinions and feelings. They'll interact with other members of your troop, basically, and they'll even like begin romantic relationships with each other if you're not engaging with them yourself, which is kind of interesting. Because when we did a Q&A after we played the game for a bit, somebody asked, hey, can I like sabotage other relationships? Like, say I want to get with this person who's in the party, but this other companion wants to get with them as well. Can I sabotage that relationship? And they were very coy about it, but the devs said, well, there's no like sabotage relationship button, but they will hypothetically, let's just say, come to you for advice. And nobody's saying that you have to give them good advice. And if you give them bad advice and they make a mistake, that relationship probably doesn't work out, which is just kind of cool. The idea that there's like romance options with companions, and then they'll even try to have romances between each other, and then you can sabotage those or interact with those. That's the kind of interaction with companions. This feels maybe inappropriate to make that hand gesture, but you get what I mean. You know, there's interactivity with companion. I'm going to move on. And then lastly, I just want to know about console performance. We got to play the game on PC. I don't know how this will run or look on console because it seems like everything we've seen so far is on PC, which is fair because that's where it's going to look the best. But still, I'd like to see if this is going to be running well on like a Series S, or how does it look on the PS5 Pro? Is it going to be receiving some enhancement there? I know it hasn't been announced yet, but maybe it does receive an enhancement. I'd like to know that stuff, and I'm sure we'll find out more about that as we get closer to launch. But with all that said, guys, I'm going to call it there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making my dreams a reality. Let me know what you think of Dragon Age the Veilguard after these previews have dropped, because mine is not the only one going up today when you're seeing this. And I'll see you very soon. Thank you for watching. I love you all. I'll see you next time. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye.